I want to have some fun with you all today, trying to capture some of this week and some things which I think, as people said earlier, Debbie Creamer said, I'm trying out something. And I am trying out something today that I haven't done before, that is, again, partly tongue-in-cheek, but also utterly serious at the same time. The first part's a compilation of some of what I've learned over time about community building. The second part goes in a different way. And I didn't give out the handouts because I want you to look at the things as we're going along, and I'll describe some of the pictures. So community building, art, symbol, song, embrace, spirituality, story, eating, and danced. Who's being assessed? See how clever that was? It didn't fall together till last night. Gaventa tends to look for, I tend to be a person who looks for, partly because out of training by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, to look for the simplicity beyond the complexity, as Einstein would say. In the midst of all the complexity of everything, what is that simplicity that's beyond, that captures everything? You just saw a master of that do this just a little while ago. But what's the simplicity beyond the complexity of things? And I tend to be one of my obsessions. The focus of this week has been on identity and growth. It's amazing, in fact, to me how this week is focused on the theme we had for the week, but usually we just put that theme up just for dressing sake. Yeah, it's like, okay, what are we going to call this year? But the focus has been a lot on who am I? Who are we? Who are we? Let me get this right. And it's not, again, those are not easy questions. Easy answers are easy questions in the middle of what we have called the confusing questions, the messiness, the chaotic stuff, the liminal spaces in between things. But think about identity and growth. There's a wonderful presentation by Ed Friedman, which is kind of one of my sacred texts. It's a videotape. The man responsible, the Jewish pastoral counselor responsible for what's the name of his famous book? Generation to Generation, Family Systems. He did a presentation at Dialogue 94, the conference of the Congress on Ministries in Specialized Settings in 1994, and the title of it was Togetherness and Stuck Togetherness, the Importance of Leadership. And one of the things he did in that talk is to say that we too often sacrifice community for the sake of identity, a la I am somebody, this is who I am, and we have no sense of connection and interdependence and dependence, which is a classic American sin in different ways. But the other, he said, is we sacrifice identity for the sake of community. That too often we try to get connected to people in ways that may not be healthy. That we get stuck together with people in ways that keep us from naming and saying who I am. It's like the classic peacemaker in me that wants to say, don't be angry at something for the sake of keeping the peace. Deny myself, to that sense of keeping the peace, maintaining a relationship, but not refusing to claim my own identity in the midst of things, or to draw my identity from somebody else rather than naming it for myself. One of the real famous psychologists, I think they do offer some good things, is Robert Kagan. Oops. Okay. How do I go back? Okay. Robert Kagan, and he's got a wonderful book on identity and formation of identity, and his words for that and his titles are incorporative, impulsive, imperial, interpersonal, institutional, and intra-individual. You read the book, it's pretty complex. It's kind of like James Fowler, Stages of Faith. It's almost so complex you can't read it and you can't use it. Now, I read the book and sort of translated this into Gaventa speak for me, which was I am you, which is the child before being born or right after being birthed. There's no identity. I am my mom. I am you. And then as the child becomes an infant and starts growing, the mother becomes a child's possession. You're mine. If you want to ask a mom who's in control, often it's the baby who's in control. You're mine. And then as we get older and move into the 5th, 6th, 7 years, 8 years, I'm me. Look at what I can do. Look at what I can do. And you move into those middle years, teenagers and so on, and I'm yours. The importance of peer pressure. I identify with the group. I'm learning how to get connected with other people. And then if we gradually grow up into what we would call an adult identity, it's I am, and you fill in the blank. Who are you? What's that question we've all been talking about? Who are you? How would you describe yourself? Who are you? What's your identity? And then as we keep on growing, at least for me, and this is true for me, the awareness gradually becomes is I am some this, but I am also us. I am us. I'm connected to everybody, connected to the world. Stages of identity in a kind of simplicity. Now, Parker Palmer talks about community with 2 important axioms. That community is the place where the person you would rather not be happens to be. Got that? Hear that carefully. Community, we often say, we would be a community except for that person. And his second axiom is, as soon as that person leaves, somebody else will automatically take their place. And what it says something about is the capacity of the unconscious life of any group or any community to make a limited person or a stranger or a person with a disability or something, to make somebody a kind of scapegoat for the lack of sense of community or unity that's there. And when words fail, and when PowerPoints fail, all right, I'm stuck. Wait a minute. Let's see now. It goes 5 times. That was a fast presentation. That was a fast presentation. Yeah, right. So when words fail, and I won't even say before words, and the next slide has got a link to a talk by Vincent van Hastings, which I heard earlier this summer. He's a religion and science expert from South Africa, teaches at Princeton Theological Seminary. And I went to hear one of his lectures out of these, and they do a religion and science series. And it was called The Emergence of Self, and that's his new book. And what Vincent doesn't know anything about disability at all. But he looks at anthropology and archaeology and history and psychology, looking at the earliest ways in which human beings began to form out of the clay of the earth in terms of evolutionary work, and sort of pre-words, pre-symbols, and the ways, and the lecture is about the ways in which we are created and grow into beings who are related to a divine even before we can talk about it. It's a fascinating piece, and it has huge implications, I think, for people who we say don't have the kind of reasoning ability or the capacity that others. What about people who don't have the same kind of cognitive skills? So I said to Vincent afterwards, you're talking about what we're talking about, and you don't know it, so we got to get together at some point. And that happens increasingly, I think, for me in lots of fields. But it's well worth your time to take an hour for that. You going to do it? And when words fails, you turn to art. You turn to art, just as we did here yesterday afternoon. And when you turn to art, you also turn to symbol. Cindy said, I love symbols. John McKnight said, this is not a community, the symbol of the organizational chart. What he didn't say is that you really need some of these organizations. He says, I don't rely upon a neighborhood association to fly me from Chicago to New York. If you want to get somewhere at a certain amount of time, you really need that, some of those kinds of organizations. Now, and what he didn't use was his classic symbol is, this can be a community. Is your glass half full or half empty? What do you see? What do you see? And it's from the asset side, the half-full side, that's the perspective that says there are assets everywhere. What are you looking for? And how do we see that? And I love this one that I got off the internet because this is a glass half full with legs on it, which says maybe you're going somewhere. These can be communities, the next subgroup. These can be a bar, a church, a school, a farmer's market, my favorite community place, a village square, a village center, or a village square, places where, as he is in the language of the system, where are the third places that people come together? You've got work, you've got home, but what are those third places where people come together and gather together and have the chance of meeting people who you don't know, the third places? And that's part of the lingo of community building. And we don't have so many pubs as they do in Scotland. That's where I know John's got most of his education about community and neighborhood, but those are just crucial places in kind of any neighborhood and can be. And if you look back, if any of you saw Ken Burns's series on the what's the name of it? It's about the prohibition movement in this country earlier this year. If you looked at the prohibition movement, it was led by women who became leaders because they were sick and tired of their husbands going to the pub on Friday night and spending all their paycheck for the week. It was not so much anti-drinking as it was pro-family and pro-community. But in every immigrant population that's come to this country, there have been two primary third places, and those have been the saloons and the faith communities. The saloons and faith communities. And saloons was where you got your jobs, where you connected, where you met the union guys, where you did those kinds of things. And then from art symbol to think about, we could do this. We could do it all day, the rest of the day. What are your symbols? I love to do this. What are your symbols? At our CPE program, we have our students come for the first day and say, bring a symbol that represents who you are and talk about it. A symbol out of your life that's something about your symbol. And for your symbols and the work you do in community building and inclusion, what are your symbols for that? There can be any kind of number of those. Is it body? Is it circle? Is it seedling growing? What are those symbols of that? And this may or may not be a relationship between two people, and what I've got is a picture up here, several different things from clip art on the web about two people, and they may be talking to each other as friends, but also may be fighting or maybe turning away from each other. That two people may or may not a community be or a relationship be, and you know that just as well as I do. But this might have a better chance of being community, and which in pastoral care we called a long time ago, Chuck Gherkin had that pastoral care is one meeting another in the presence of a third. John McKnight just talked about who are the connectors. What are the things that connect people? What are the things? Is it an interest? Who's the connector, the kind of connectors? What are the things that connect people? Where do those things happen? When do those people who connect around those interests, when do those things happen? How do we do it? And the most important piece of all, of course, in the work we do is why we do it. Why are we doing that? Why are we trying to build that kind of community? If you want some more lengthy playing around with that symbol, it took me 30 years to learn this, because I spent 20 years, the first part of my role as a chaplain, trying to make people from here to here get connected and to do it directly. But there's so many projections and expectations and fears and anxieties or things that shouldn't happen, and I'll get back to that in a bit, but the kinds of fears and worries that other people have about disability, yada, yada. There's so much complexity there that the sort of utter simplicity of saying maybe the best way to get there is between a shared love, like the Chicago Cubs, or like going to church, or like whatever, going to the bar. like the police station, like the police. I can repeat that story in New Jersey out of this year, one of our CPE students, that kind of same story. So that kind of symbolic thing about what community can mean for me has become the symbol of that. But the most effective symbolic form of communication that all of you know is, of course, music. Music is the universal language. There's a picture of our musicians here every day who have brought us together. And music means songs. And there are pictures of people singing on this slide in different kinds of forms and formats. And then in the middle of that slide is Luke Claiborne. And the song, if you haven't seen it, in the next slide, you've got the link. If we had time, we'd play it today. But it comes from the book called The Year of Our Lord, which made it onto CNN News. Luke Claiborne is a young man with cerebral palsy who can't walk. He usually kneels and walks on his knees. He is part of the choir of a black Pentecostal church in the Mississippi Delta and sings within the choir every week without words but with just the sounds. And it's lost in the gospel music. It's in the gospel music. That is his community. And he quite frankly says, I like black people a whole lot better than I like white people. Yeah, amen. Your turn's coming. But if you haven't read the book is a beautiful book. And again, one of the beautiful pieces about it is it wasn't written by somebody who was interested in disability inclusion. It was written by a fictional author who was well known for other things, and a well-known photographer who got captured by the story of Luke being part of this Pentecostal church in the Mississippi Delta, which is one of course, the poorest places in this country. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it. And then song, as you know, can be prayer, as we did yesterday. So what's our song as a disability, quote, movement? At a conference in Rochester in 1986, Bob Persky came and talked, and he'd just been to the first self-advocacy conference in New Jersey. And he rode with a number of people who were going to the conference in a van. They were all playing John Denver songs. Take Me Home, Country Mama, Take Me Home to Where I Belong, West Virginia, all those kinds of songs. And Bob came away realizing, if we say we're a movement, we're the only movement in this country without a song. That every other single movement in this country, civil rights, other kinds, have had songs. Union songs, civil rights songs, other kinds of songs. What are our songs? What are your songs? We could spend the day saying, what's your favorite song? And talking about that and why. So what are some of the songs that could be on that list? They include This Little Light of Mine. We all think is a children's song. No, it was a civil rights marching song. Civil rights marching song. Amazing Grace, West Virginia, Take Me Home. It's Awesome to Be Surrounded, like we used the other day with Tom Hunter. Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, Lamentation, Blues. Oh Freedom, Blessed Be the Ties. Don't Walk in Front of Me, a Jewish song that we used to be the motto of a program we helped to run in Rochester with the Jewish Center with people with and without disabilities. And it's a very simple song that goes, don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Don't walk behind me, I may not lead. Just walk beside me and be my friend, and together we'll walk in the way of God. Don't walk in front of me, I may not follow. Don't walk behind me, I may not lead. Just walk beside me and be my friend, and together we will walk in the way of God. Off tune, all that kind of stuff. But you'll see about that in just a minute. So help us find the songs. John McKnight says, it's only in community that you will hear singing. It's only in community that you will hear singing. And another famous saying, even from Scotland, where there's some wisdom, a philosopher from Scotland who said once, and I don't know who it is, and maybe you do, but said, let anyone who wants to write a country's laws, let me write their songs. Let me write their songs, because of the power and the way that captivates and motivates and leads people. And you can't have community without eating. You know about the power of breaking bread together, the symbol of the banquet, the necessary part of hospitality. In fact, in some parts of the world, you welcome a stranger, and before you even start talking, there are tea and food shared and water and liquid before you even start talking to find out why you're there, which is one of the dilemmas, of course, in many human service professionals in this country when they're supposed to make home visits and their agencies say you can't accept anything from the people, gifts from the people you work with, and to walk into somebody's home, it's an insult to them if you don't accept then what they have to offer and that kind of thing. And the words are part of a verbatim that one of my earliest CPE students wrote in Rochester years ago about a man going to a Baptist church for the first time from a group home, or not the first time, but one of the first times, and she was there as associate pastor, and was about after he had experienced communion with the service. And he comes up to the pastor afterwards and says, "What did we do in church today?" And she said, "Well, we had communion." And he says, "Tell me about it. What is that?" And he said, It's communion. It's about the Last Supper. It's about when Jesus took bread and broke it with his disciples before it. And he says, No. Don't tell me about that part. Tell me about the part of us doing it all together. I ate with you in church today. I ate with you in church today. One of the earliest for me and clearest indications of what the power of communion can be. And of course, we have had plenty of eating here. And we've even welcomed some strangers, as you can see in the first part of this picture. And we've had them eating in celebration and banquet, which is part of everything we do. And then embodied nonverbal music and song becomes, of course, dancing. And if you haven't read a book by Miroslav Volf called Exclusion and Embrace, you need to, because it's another one of those books that never talks about disability, but it's all about disability and the kind of work we've done. And in it he talks about the dance of embrace, and asks the question, are we as Christians called to embrace everybody? And he says, no, we're not. But we are called to have the will to embrace people. We are called to have the will to embrace people. And if Chantel, if you'll come up here, I want to demonstrate the closest thing I know how to dance, which would be the Miroslav Volf four-step. And this is the dance of embrace. And it goes back to this.
I'm a little scared right now.
I'm Southern Baptist. I'm even more scared. You heard the joke the other night about why Southern Baptists are scared, don't like sex, because they're afraid it might lead to dancing. But if you think about that picture with the two of us here, back to that triangle, think of all the things that could happen if she and I didn't already begin to know each other a little bit this week. And if I'm this Christian who thinks that I'm supposed to embrace everybody and help everybody, my stance would be to come over and just...
I would love that.
Yeah. Right, but you wouldn't if I was a stranger. No. Right? But I will now. Our theories are always getting shattered, aren't they? No, but the point of it was, stay here for a minute. What Volf says, if the dance, the fourth step is, I take a step towards you with my arms out open, but then my next step is back and drop my hand and then see what needs to be said between the two of us. What stories need to be told? What kind of things need to happen before we can move into a real and true embrace? Because what often happens with people with disabilities is I move towards and pat you on the head, or help you whether you want to be helped or not, or the dance too often is I don't want him to be part of that. But the dance, it's been a wonderful kind of thing for me and we've talked about it this week in other ways about how do you get to know somebody, and especially in a world where there's such fear between men and women. I get in real trouble doing that in some places. I got in real trouble about this about 3 months ago. I was at the grocery store. You can go back if you want. Thank you, Van. I was at the grocery store trying to get some condensed milk for something my wife wanted to make, and there was a woman, happened to be African-American woman, who had a cart and 2 kids, and she was right in front of the condensed milk, which was down here. And she was talking with her kids and yada yada, and I kind of stood around trying to sort of say, and I didn't ask her, do you mind, because I didn't want to bother, it seemed like something important was going on. I didn't want to bother her. So finally I said, all right, and so I reached down behind and brushed up against her skirt, and she turned around to me and said, "What the hell do you think you're doing? I should sue you, I'm a lawyer." And just went into this rant about, because I had invaded her space, obviously, her physical space in a way, and she just went after, I never could say anything. There's this young woman coming down the aisle, and she said, "Is he your father? If so, you ought to be ashamed of him." It was just like, there was just nothing I could have said or done. But it was that, again, show you the importance of that kind of, and you all know it in different ways in your own lives about that kind of issue. So the 4-step. And the question then is, who chooses the partners? Does the partner choose us? Do we choose the partner, a la Ben Connor? Do we elect to dance with somebody? Do they respond to do that? And perhaps unknowingly, as we've talked about in other ways this week, we've been chosen by God to be people's partners whether we know it or not, and just maybe need to find that out. And in that listening, in that space, the language of community, of course, is story. It's not chart, it's not diagnosis, it's not plan, it's not policy. The language of community is stories. What's your story? What's my story? What's our story? Do we have a story together? If we do, after a while, that becomes his story together. And what story this is what Stan Hauerwas says, right, Hans and John? Whose story are you part of? What story has chosen you? Isn't that one of the things they use? What story has chosen you? What story are you part of that you didn't have any control over or you had to respond to? And the stories that we've shared this week and the kind of those transforming stories that are there in all of our lives about those moments of transformation, about with individuals like John McKnight was using, they're all there. Sometime we've got to figure out a way to tie all those stories together and line them up with the lectionary. So then there would be a resource for faith communities and pastors and others to use all over the world. And story then becomes spirituality. In the story and the listening, we hear the soul, as has been said, as John and Christina so wonderfully said, that spirituality is that space to listen and to hear the soul. And in the work I do on spirituality, I've come to see it as connection primarily, and connection in 5 ways: to self, to thy own self be true, to another. Oh, it's not just me. Okay, good. Got to come back. Connection in 5 ways: to self, to another or to others, to place. Think about spirituality as place. We could have a wonderful conversation by saying, what's your sacred space? What's your holiest place? Where do you go when you think about the place where I felt most the presence of God in different ways? And then to time, connection to time. We Westerners are not very good with that, but there are cultures and communities whose ancestors are present in the present, and others who live in the future. That spirituality is that kind of connection with people who've gone before and who are yet to come. And then spirituality is connection to the holy, whatever you consider to be holy. So, being a good human services professional in my human community building skills, now I want to put on my other hat, and we need to do some assessing. And the first part, let me assess the skills that I've just gone through, and this is my own personal assessment. My own personal assessment would be the next slide. Art, 0. Symbol, 8. I'm pretty good with symbol. Song and singing, 1. You heard that. Eating 10, story 8, spirituality 9, embrace 5. I've not been a very good hugger most of my life. And dance, definitely a 1. That's my Southern Baptist tradition, saying that. So those are, trying, just playing with that, those are to assess some of my skills. But as a professional, and start thinking about a new understanding of professional, and if you haven't read Parker Palmer's essay on the new professional, look it up on the web. The new professional is somebody who should know what they feel and should know my own journey, and that a professional is not called to be value-free but value-clear. Not value-free but value-clear. And then know that in the capacity then that real professional skills is the capacity to walk with others on their journey. And Arthur Frank in The Wounded Storyteller, a wonderful little book, talks about the narratives of illness or disease or disability or accident in our society. And that narrative goes, I don't think he uses the word interruption, but I'm claiming that from this week in terms of a heart attack, an accident, something that happens in your life. And there are 2 narratives in our society in response to that kind of thing. One is the cure narrative, and that's the one that gets celebrated. I got cancer, come to this cancer center, we're the best in the world, and you're cured. That's the cancer narrative. It sells big time. The other narrative is the chaos narrative. I got cancer, it shot my life to smithereens, God's gone, my friends are gone, I just don't believe in anything anymore, which is often the narrative for some people. But he poses a third alternative, and the third alternative is journey, that something happens and that begins a new kind of journey, and that's what often, of course, lots of people will tell to you. And in some of the work that I've done in the past, you all will recognize this, that there's been a movement for people. A chaplain once said to me, a Roman Catholic chaplain, when in my early days of trying to get volunteers to work with people with disabilities, he said, Bill, you know, people go from fear to pity to anger to love. From fear to pity to anger to love. By the way, you're going to get these handouts afterwards, so if you don't want to write too much, there. You're from fear to pity to anger to love. And I've played around with that for a long time, and I can't really find anything that's better to replace it, because it didn't help shape my understanding of ministry. We don't do anything with people that we're afraid of or who are outside, to then we do ministry to people or for people, to then we do ministry with people, and to then we recognize that ministry is being done to us, or we're receiving gifts from other people. So it's ministry by people with disabilities or by the people who are on the margins in different kinds of ways. And that, in fact, then can be part of the service system. If you look at the history of our service system, 1, 2, 4, I think. But the history of our service system goes from no services and supports to special services and special programs to social justice movements and then to community. That kind of in broad strokes kind of looks at kind of the history and the journey of our system. So as we, though, as professionals, one of the things that gets called now, I think, for us as, quote, professionals of any stripe, and this comes out most clearly for me in the work that I've been doing on end-of-life issues with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, is around the issue at the end of life, who are the people in somebody's life who says to somebody, you've made a difference to me, and this is how you've blessed my life. Because part of the act of aging and leaving is receiving and giving blessing in the biblical sense. And where do people with intellectual and developmental disabilities have the way or the time or place or the relationships to know that they have been a blessing or to maybe give their blessing to somebody else? And one of the only ways in people's lives whose lives are mostly full of professionals is for professionals to be able to say, this is the way you have blessed my life. Not, for the individual to say, oh, thank you, doctor, psychologist, chaplain, you've been such a great help to me, which is pure, in some ways, BS. Because most of us as professionals are called to be, and have been called into this story, not because of what we give, but by what we receive. And the way we continue to learn. So where do we help tell people that they've been a gift and a blessing to us in a variety? Where do we get that mutuality and that vulnerability back into this part equation? So let me put on the human services hat again for a minute and say, if we're going to use assessments and assess people to death who have disabilities, then to be mutual and fair, we ought to start assessing the assessors. We ought to start assessing the assessors. And so as a companion self-assessment scales, these have just been created and are just hot off the press. They have not been empirically tested or validated. But companion self-assessment scales, first of all is, I forgot this part. In playing around with those movements, I've also played around with earlier, the old things about mild, moderate, severe, and profound. And people approach those folks can do it in two ways, either with a sense of curiosity or a sense of anxiety. And so somebody's a little bit different, you get curious. Somebody's a little bit different, you get anxious. And either path goes in a couple of different directions. Curiosity can lead to amazement, to wonder, and to mystery. As Jean Vanier says, some people like Tima, the pictures we saw the other night, she is mystery. She is mystery. Wonder can be when we see a person who we don't think ever could do anything or say anything, says something. Like the guy who a long time ago when I gave a birthday card to in the old institution where I worked on a unit where nobody could talk, or so I thought. And most of them were in those old cribs. And my pastoral care visitation strategy was to go give people birthday cards because nobody ever celebrated the day they were born. And I went one day to give a birthday card to Charlie, who I'd not met before. And Charlie was an old guy sitting in a wheelchair by the window, 1,000 wrinkles going this way. I went over and knelt down beside him and said, Charlie, it's your birthday today. And slowly these wrinkles started to go up like this into a smile, and then they dropped again. He started to reach out his hand, drew it back, dropped again, and he spoke. Oh my God, he spoke. I didn't expect him to be able to speak at all. You know what he said? But I don't have anything to pay you for it. Think about being in a society where it's all about exchange. It's about earning love, about what do I have to do to achieve a goal or to get a blessing. It mirrors many of us. As Parker Palmer says, people with intellectual disabilities puncture the illusion that we have to earn love. And the trouble with unconditional love and our giving that to other people is that most of us have never gotten it, so we don't know how to give what we haven't gotten. We don't know how to give what we haven't gotten. So, but the pathway to the anxiety, you go from anxiety to fear, to terror, to despair. People could look at Tima and be utterly in despair and say there's nothing that could ever happen here, that despair could be part of that. So those two kind of alternative forms of journey. But then, now to go back to our companion self-assessment thing. To start with, next one. All right, so here's our assessment scales. First off, where do I stand? As far away as possible, over, on top of, in front of, sometimes in the part of social justice, we can get ahead of the people that we're working with or advocating for or working with. And people will say, out of your anger about the injustice, don't go fix it for me, walk with me, do it with me. But we can so often get in front of people. And alongside in community, where do I stand? Ambulation, where do we walk? On the opposite sides or away from, as far as fast as possible. In front of people, alongside people, and truly side by side. Truly side by side. What do I see? Demon, cripple, citizen, or neighbor, colleague, and friend. Demon, cripple, disabled person, holy angel, holy innocent, citizen in social justice, neighbor, colleague, and friend. What do I hear? Nothing. Cry, wail, anguish, the poor people who are crying, What do I hear in social justice? Shouts, speeching, and advocacy. What do I hear in community celebration? Celebration and party, or singing, as John McKnight would say. How about my fine motor control? Don't touch. Pat somebody on the head. Fist in the air. And holding hands. What's my awareness of their environment? Where are they? They're hidden, or in special programs, or in streets, courts, and legislatures, or in my neighborhood, my church, my community, my place, my workplace. Whose authority counts? Whose voice counts? The creatures of mythology, the voices of the legends, those are the stereotypes that seem to live. Or the family, professional, and surrogates' voices, usually with others who not hearing their own. That's why the focus of the whole self-determination movement. My voice or their voice or theirs for the social justice, and in community whose voices count is ours, all of ours, everybody's voice. Chris? What's my musical aptitude? What songs do we hear? Wails and howls in the first version of those out in the demons, the demonic. If you haven't read, by the way, Christine Guth's first-person account of the Gerasene demoniac, you ought to do that. It's in the journal, back in the back issues. It's writing about the Gerasene demoniac as if she was, or was the Gerasene demoniac, and it's a wonderful story. And it's a story that's very important to me. Out of the story, some of you know this, but the first time I was in the secure unit because of a major depression in 1995, my son Matthew, who was about 16 at the time, talked his way past Nurse Cratchit and said, I'm going to go see my dad whether you want me to or not. And a couple of weeks later, he was with my wife at the therapist that I'd been going to, and they were going to, just to talk about all this. And Beverly took him and said, you know, Dad's depression is kind of like this demon. It's like it's got a hold of him and won't let him go. And the most redeeming thing that I've ever heard in my life that I've used so often again and again is when my son, who grew up with a pastor and a New Testament scholar, said, and he's quick as a wit, said, well, it's too bad there's not a herd of pigs around when you need one. And it was right to the heart. The issue was control. And can I live with parts of me that I can't control? Or can I try to be in control of too much stuff? So, musical aptitude, Wail and Howls, Lamentations and the Blues, the Sorrows, the protest and movement songs and social justice, and then the love songs, or the community songs. Okay, Chris? Heart condition. Clogged arteries, meaning there's no blood being exchanged, you can't get the care, the lifeblood is just not getting between people. In the second time, the arteries are good or the veins are kind of problematic. We're good at giving out to people, but we don't get it back very well. We don't receive it back. There's not much recognition of mutuality. Social justice, high blood pressure, often. And in a community, hopefully our hearts are open, but also vulnerable and incredibly strong. Behavior, what do? Do we kill or abandon people? Do we protect and help? Do we support? Or do we appreciate? Theistic ideology, why did it happen? Devil or sin first? Was it God who did it? And the question changes to why am I treated this way? And ultimately, we don't need an answer. It's a question beside the point. It was a mom in North Carolina who taught me that the second year I was in this, who had a child with Down syndrome, and she said, I used the book J.B., the modern rendition of Job, to struggle with this and read it again and again, and I finally realized Job never got an answer to his question, but he didn't have to, he just went on. Never got an answer, but just went on. But he needed to ask the question. What's their calling or vocation? i.e. the real question about why, not the why something happened to you, but what am I called to be? What's the real question? In the old times, a person with a disability is a scapegoat. In now many places, still designated receiver, not driver, but designated receiver, self-advocate, and then in community, hopefully the question is, who am I called to be and what am I called to be? What's my vocation for everybody? Or as William Barclay said, somebody quoted them, John, did you quote William Barclay yesterday? One of my recent favorite sayings of his, that the two most important days in somebody's life are the day you're born and the day you figure out why. The day you're born and the day you figure out why. So what's the purpose of research that I'm in? To find the cause, to find a new technology, procedure, or something to help fix. Research for rights and empowerment, or participatory research a la Christina and John based on their questions and the things that are important to them. To us. What's good? Nothing. In the first part, observable outcomes, new legislation, or friendship and connection. And I owe a debt of thanks to John here because he said in one of his pieces once that in our system we have taken what we think to be what we define good and true and beautiful is what's observable, measurable, and replicable. So you're going to see that here in just a minute. What do we measure? Degree of sin, guilt, or fear. Deficits, injustices, skills, gifts, and dreams. What's truth? Legends and myth, suffering and stereotypes, charts and data, oppression, victims, and rights, our shared story. Parker Palmer says, when I begin to tell you my story and your story, then in the world of science, truth can be disproven by another different set of facts. But in the world of relationship, my truth may be different than your truth. And by sharing my truth and you share your truth, we become, the root to the word truth is troth. We become betrothed, connected to each other in profound kinds of ways. What's beautiful? The freaks are the divine messengers. The old circle are the angels, or the people with disabilities who are assumed to be the holy ones sometimes in society. What's beautiful? IEP goals that are met. Being happy, appreciative, proud faces, or replicable outcomes. What's beautiful? Rights won, choices honored. What's beautiful is in the eye of the beholder. The beauty changes for different people. What's the major professional discipline involved in these? In the first, mythology empowered by religion. What I mean by that, the scapegoat, the outcast, then people saying that's God's that way, or it's God's will, or it's demonic possession, or whatever. When you take the stereotypes and add God's name to it, it multiplies the power in so many different ways. You know those wounds. What's the major professional discipline in human services? Often rehabilitation, habilitation, therapies of one kind or another, education, and more. Again, not bad. They're not bad. They're a whole lot better than the first. And that's the key thing in this. All these are a whole lot better than certainly the first column. What's major professional discipline is law. And the major professional discipline, I think, now, and this is my favorite definition of what a professional is these days, is a professional is somebody who knows what they don't know and are willing to ask. Somebody who knows what they don't know and are willing to ask. What about writing skills, fiction, story, evidence-based practices, the word we hear all the time, policy and legal briefs, and story, and writing story. So in that community then, where are you? Where are you? Can we take, the danger though, of course, is before we start taking the log out of other people's eyes, can we take the log out of our own before we start identifying the specks in other people's eyes? Because the danger is, and this is the theological journey, that so often happens is that people go from experience to story to testimony to doctrine to dogma to creed, and that usually takes hundreds of years, but in our system and sometimes in churches it takes about 15 seconds. From my story becomes everybody's, what people have to do, and this is the only way we're going to do it. The only way we're going to do it. If you think that churches are the only ones who don't have dogma and doctrine, you haven't worked in the human service system. Or as Eric talked about the sacred text the other day on your slide. So the demonic power, though, of stages, of those kinds of things that I just did, or charts, or like the demonic power of that, is turning story and moments and times into terminology and into controlled process. The most famous example of which is Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and of dying, of going from shock to denial to bargaining to depression to acceptance. And I can't tell you how many stories I've heard over the years about chaplains who said, from chaplains about others who said, and use this with patients and saying, oh, that's where you are, stage 2. You know, that's where you are, stage 2. How do we get you to stage 3? Or something like that. And we use that in human service professionals, you know, all the time. Plans, programs, how do we get you there? And what really is true, though, about Kubler-Ross, and you say this to pastoral care students, is it's not so much about them as it is about us. Because it gives me a way of organizing what I hear from other people so I don't run from them. So I can be present. So I can control my anxiety, so I have a framework which may be proven to be wrong, like Chantel just proved me to be wrong earlier, or as anybody in grief will say, there's no such thing as a go here to there because it's always like this. It goes round and round and over again. So the huge demonic power of those kinds of assessments and stage thinking in different ways. And then we get into reactive identities where we become the snobs, where we become self-righteous, where we become the thank God I'm not like those people. You know, the thank God I'm not like those people who run special programs. Well, wait a minute. What's that good is that going to do anybody in that part? And we've got to remember what Parker Palmer said, a member, community is where the person you would rather not have happens to be. And in this community that we're working with, people are at all places on those, quote, assessment scales, and they're part of our community. And until we recognize that and help try to find ways for people to get connected and tell different stories and help people understand why, maybe where they were, that there's a different perspective. But if we start using it to preach at people, we're really in trouble about the shoulds. So ultimately, assessment, if you don't know the root of it, the root of the word assessment means to sit next to. Sit next to. It's a whole lot different than what we usually use, because assessments become ways of distancing and objectifying. To sit next to. And if we sit next to, then the enemy, as an African saying, an enemy is somebody whose story you don't know. Enemy is somebody whose story you don't know, because once I know your story, it's pretty hard to keep you as an enemy. And one of my favorite pieces from Henry Nouwen out of Gracias is, of course, the great paradox. So we've talked about paradox all week. That the great paradox of ministry, therefore, is that we minister above all with our weakness. A weakness that invites us to receive from those to whom we go. The more in touch we are with our own need for healing and salvation, the more open we are to receive in gratitude what others have to offer us. The true skill of ministry is to help fearful and often oppressed men and women become aware of their own gifts by receiving them in gratitude. In a sense, ministry becomes the skill of active dependency. Active dependency, willing to be dependent on what others have to give, but often do not realize they have. So, and Parker at this conference in 1986 started off by saying, community ultimately is not a goal we achieve, but a gift we receive. We're part of community whether we know it or not. The question is, can we open up and be part of that and receive that as a whole? And that's all I got to say.